When Britain entered the Second World War in September 1939, its air defenses were still shaped by the trauma of the First. In 1917 and 1918, German Gotha bombers had crossed the Channel almost unopposed, proving that a determined enemy could strike civilian populations from the sky. But the interwar years brought deep cuts to military spending, and while radar and fighter command began transforming the Royal Air Force, Britain's ground-based anti-aircraft arm remained fragile, underfunded, and dominated by old First World War equipment. Heavy guns existed, but they were cumbersome, slow to deploy, and too few in number. Small-caliber automatic guns, the kind needed to hit fast, low-flying aircraft, were almost completely absent. By the mid-1930s, however, the rise of the Luftwaffe made it clear that Britain needed something new. A fast-tracking, rapid-firing weapon that could hit a diving Stuka or a screaming Heinkel at close range. British designers experimented with domestic options, but nothing matched the reliability or rate of fire they needed. The answer came not from Woolwich or Enfield, but from a small Swedish company, AB Bofors. Their 40mm L/60 gun was already gaining a reputation in Europe as a compact, lightweight, brutally efficient anti-aircraft system. Unlike heavy static guns, the Bofors could be manned by a small crew, traverse quickly, and maintain a blistering firing rhythm of about 120 rounds per minute. For a country expecting to be attacked from the air before its armies ever engaged in battle, it was exactly the kind of weapon Britain could no longer ignore. Yet acquiring it was far from straightforward. Sweden was neutral, and wartime export restrictions made foreign procurement complex. British missions negotiated licensing rights, engineering documents, and production permissions, while also racing against Germany, which was attempting to buy the very same gun. In the end, Britain secured the rights, but its factories lacked the machinery necessary to mass-produce the Bofors to Swedish tolerances. To solve this, Britain turned to an unlikely partner, American industrial giant Chrysler, which redesigned many of the gun's components for faster, assembly line manufacture. The result was a hybrid Anglo-American-Swedish design that preserved the weapon's performance while multiplying its output. By 1939, it was finally entering British service in meaningful numbers. And none too soon. The Luftwaffe's doctrine depended heavily on fast, low-level tactical strikes, exactly the profile the Bofors excelled at defeating. As Europe spiraled toward war, Britain's lightweight gun was beginning to look less like a foreign import and more like the cornerstone of a new defensive philosophy. Mobile, flexible, lethal, and ready for the skies to erupt. The speed at which the Bofors became indispensable was driven not just by Britain's needs, but also by the Luftwaffe's evolving tactics. German air planners understood that the shock effect of low-level attacks could break enemy morale long before ground forces arrived. The Stuka dive bomber was built around that idea. A shrieking, near-vertical dive that delivered a precision strike while terrifying anyone on the ground. Conventional heavy guns, 3-inch and 3.7-inch pieces, could track strategic bombers at high altitude, but they were almost useless against aircraft attacking at treetop level. Britain needed something that could rotate instantly, acquire a fast-moving target, elevate sharply, and maintain an unbroken stream of fire. The Bofors filled that gap with ruthless efficiency. Early British crews quickly learned that the gun's lightweight design was deceptive. The carriage was compact, the barrel relatively short compared to heavy AA guns, and the entire system could be moved by a small tractor or even manhandled when needed. But the impact it delivered was anything but light. A single 40mm round could tear through the engine block of a Stuka or shred the wing of a Ju-88. More importantly, the Bofors could maintain a sustained rate of fire without overheating or jamming, vital in the chaos of a real battle. Its mechanical simplicity made it easy to maintain under field conditions, and its predictable recoil allowed crews to stay locked on a target even as they fired. The first major test came during the grim months of 1940. As British troops retreated toward the Channel ports, Bofors guns stationed along roads, bridges, and temporary defensive lines became the only real shield against the Luftwaffe's relentless harassment. At Dunkirk, they earned a reputation far beyond what their numbers suggested. German pilots accustomed to flying low with impunity suddenly found streams of accurate fire cutting through their attack runs. Several Luftwaffe after-action reports complained that British light AA fire was unexpectedly precise, and intense enough to disrupt bombing accuracy. What the reports described, without naming it, was almost always the Bofors. As the guns spread across the British Army and the Royal Artillery's anti-aircraft units, a pattern emerged. Wherever the Bofors appeared, German pilots were forced to adjust altitude, widen attack angles, or abandon dives altogether. Denying the Luftwaffe its preferred attack profile weakened its effectiveness more than raw aircraft losses ever could. In an air campaign defined by speed and shock, even a slight hesitancy was enough to tilt the balance. And while Dunkirk proved the gun's urgency, the months that followed would demonstrate its long-term strategic value, as Britain braced for the next, and potentially decisive, phase of the Luftwaffe's assault. As the summer of 1940 unfolded, the Bofors transitioned from a battlefield stopgap to one of the defining weapons of Britain's homeland defense. The Luftwaffe shifted from attacking retreating armies to striking at Britain itself. Radar and hurricanes could blunt the threat at altitude, but once German aircraft broke through the fighter screen, it fell to the Bofors and its crews to protect airfields, factories, and ports from low-level strafing and bombing. The gun's mobility allowed it to shift rapidly between threatened sectors, and its simple sighting system, initially manual, later improved with mechanical predictors, proved surprisingly effective against fighters and fighter bombers making high-speed passes. Airfields became the crucible in which the Bofors earned its reputation. Luftwaffe commanders believed that striking RAF bases at low altitude would be decisive. Destroying hangars, fuel dumps, and parked aircraft would cripple fighter command far faster than dogfights alone. But the Bofors fundamentally altered this calculus. Whether placed at dispersal points or along approach routes, the guns created deadly curtains of fire that forced attacking aircraft to break off, climb, or twist out of their attack dives. Photographs from the period often show Hurricanes still parked with mechanics working beneath them, while just behind, a Bofors crew tracks a Messerschmitt racing across the field only meters above the ground. The Luftwaffe soon learned that the gun's lethality extended beyond static defense. The British Army began mounting Bofors on truck beds and specially designed platforms, creating mobile AA troops that could follow armored and infantry formations. These roving batteries made low-level reconnaissance hazardous and disrupted the Luftwaffe's ability to coordinate attacks with ground units. In North Africa, where the open desert offered few places to hide, these mobile Bofors units proved especially valuable. German and Italian pilots found themselves diving into a landscape where the gun's sharp, rhythmic thump could come from any direction, often from positions hastily established minutes earlier. Even the Royal Navy embraced the gun. Destroyers, escort vessels, and later corvettes fitted Bofors mounts to defend against torpedo bombers and dive attacks. Its relatively light weight allowed installation where heavier naval AA guns simply couldn't fit. For ships facing the deadly threat of the Ju-87 Stuka or Italian Sparviero torpedo aircraft, this nimble 40mm gun became a critical line of defense. By late 1940 and early 1941, Luftwaffe pilots increasingly reported that low-level attacks against British targets had become costly and unpredictable. It was not only about aircraft lost, it was about the erosion of tactical confidence. A strike pilot hesitating for even a second during a dive run disrupted timing, accuracy, and formation integrity. The Bofors didn't just shoot down planes. It altered Luftwaffe behavior, forcing German aircrews to fight Britain on less favorable terms. And as the war expanded across continents, the gun proved it was not merely suited for the Battle of Britain. It was adaptable enough to meet the Luftwaffe wherever the conflict spread next. Wherever the war expanded, the Bofors followed, proving that its success in Britain had not been a narrow, defensive phenomenon, but part of a much wider transformation in how modern armies confronted air power. By 1941, as German forces pushed deep into the Balkans, North Africa, and the Soviet Union, the Luftwaffe increasingly relied on fast, low-altitude strikes to maintain momentum. Britain and its Commonwealth allies, now fighting across multiple theaters, required a weapon that could endure harsh climates, rough terrain, and relentless operational pressure. The Bofors adapted to each environment with a versatility that few other anti-aircraft systems could match. In the deserts of North Africa, its reputation only grew stronger. Heat, sand, and dust wreaked havoc on many mechanical systems, Yet the Bofors remained remarkably reliable. Commonwealth crews, Australian, New Zealand, South African, Indian, and British, often remarked that the gun just kept firing, even when vehicles, radios, and heavier equipment were breaking down around them. German pilots, who had become accustomed to sweeping low over British columns during the early desert campaigns, found that the landscape was no longer permissive. The arrival of more Bofors batteries meant that each attack run now carried real risk, especially for aircraft like the Ju-87 Stuka, whose slow pullout from a dive made it vulnerable to concentrated, accurate fire. The gun's impact was also felt in the Mediterranean, where the Luftwaffe sought to dominate the airspace over key naval and air supply routes. Malta, in particular, became a showcase for the Bofors' value. The island endured one of the heaviest sustained bombing campaigns of the war, and its anti-aircraft defenses, reinforced with Bofors guns brought in through perilous convoys, played a central role in keeping the island operational. Films and photographs from the siege capture the gun's silhouettes dug into rocky terraces and positioned beside improvised shelters. Luftwaffe losses over Malta never reached the catastrophic levels of their Eastern Front battles, but the persistent presence of Bofors fire forced German and Italian aircraft to abandon low-level tactics entirely, pushing them into higher-altitude operations where accuracy declined sharply. Meanwhile, in the Far East, the gun faced its first encounters with Japanese air power. Although the early months of the Pacific War were marked by Allied retreats, the Bofors proved one of the few systems capable of consistently disrupting Japanese low-level attacks and torpedo runs. On ships, in jungle clearings, and around airstrips carved from tropical terrain, the gun delivered the same familiar rhythm of fire that had protected Britain months earlier. By 1942, a clear picture had emerged. The Bofors was not merely a weapon Britain used, it was a weapon Britain depended on. And as Allied offensives grew bolder, the need for a fast, accurate, and mobile light anti-aircraft gun would become even more pressing. As the war entered its decisive middle years, Britain's reliance on the Bofors evolved from urgent necessity to strategic principle. The Luftwaffe, once feared for its ability to break armies and demoralize civilian populations through precision low-level strikes, now faced a battlefield environment fundamentally reshaped by light anti-aircraft fire. The Bofors did not eliminate the threat of German air power. No single weapon could, but it denied the Luftwaffe the freedom of maneuver that had made blitzkrieg possible. Attacks that once relied on surprise and precision were forced into higher, less accurate profiles. Reconnaissance missions became costlier, and close support operations increasingly required fighter escorts, drawing valuable aircraft away from other fronts. The weapon's importance only grew during the Allied offensives of 1943 and 1944. As the British Army advanced through Italy and prepared for operations in Northwest Europe, mobile Bofors units were embedded deeper into the organization of every formation. Armored divisions, infantry brigades, supply columns, and engineering units all moved with light AA protection close at hand. The gun's presence allowed Allied columns to maintain momentum even under threat of sudden air attack, a critical advantage when advancing through narrow mountain passes or across exposed Norman fields. German aircraft attempting to strike these columns found themselves confronted by disciplined Bofors crews whose training and reflexes had been sharpened by years of combat. D-Day underscored this evolution. When Allied forces landed in Normandy, thousands of ships and landing craft carried Bofors guns crewed by Royal Navy and Royal Marines. The weapon's sharp, continuous fire disrupted Luftwaffe attempts to strike the beaches and channel approaches. Although German air strength in the west had already declined, those aircraft that did appear faced heavy, coordinated barrage fire, much of it delivered by the lightweight 40mm gun that had become a familiar part of Britain's war effort. In the weeks that followed, as the breakout from Normandy intensified, Bofors batteries moved swiftly inland, taking positions along hedgerows, crossroads, and newly captured airfields. Wherever German aircraft attempted to reassert control, the gun was there, its presence one more burden on an air force already stretched to breaking. By the final year of the war, the Luftwaffe's collapse owed much to structural weaknesses: fuel shortages, pilot attrition, and industrial devastation. But behind these broader forces lay a constant tactical reality that pilots repeatedly encountered from France to Burma. Britain's 40mm Bofors had turned low-level flying into a gamble. It was not the most glamorous weapon of the war, nor the largest, nor the most technologically advanced. But its reliability, accuracy, and mobility made it one of the great equalizers of the conflict. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, crews who had spent years tracking shadows across the sky dismantled their weapons for the last time. Many would later say that the gun's steady rhythm felt like the heartbeat of the war, a simple mechanical chorus that had been present in every major campaign. And although newer systems would replace it in the post-war decades, the legacy of the Bofors remained clear. A lightweight weapon that had forced the Luftwaffe to fight differently, fly differently, and ultimately accept that the low skies over Britain and her armies were no longer theirs to dominate.